Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me as today I discuss the fact that we've had a failure in journalism throughout the COVID pandemic. The sad part is that this failure largely could occur in relation to other things as well. But what we recognize is that without journalism, without true journalism, where governments and politicians and business people are afraid of doing the wrong thing because the journalists will expose them, we are in a very dangerous situation where people can get away with doing the wrong thing and there are no consequences. Now, what I'll be sharing with you is a very interesting admission from a Mariana Cloak. And this was from the National Citizens Inquiry in Canada. And I'll be playing that for you just shortly. But that Canadian inquiry is technically a global inquiry because everything that they're asking there is representative of what happened in most of the world. And so, in reality, we will learn a lot from just listening to it. But before I start, as usual, I'll just like to remind you that today I've got a gift. And the gift is from the Health and Wellness Network. It was very exciting to do the first presentation just recently. And what you will find in the description is a link that when you subscribe and become a member, you get full access to that first webinar. Now, this is going to be just for a short period of time because it's quite valuable. We had a fascinating discussion, lots of questions were asked, and I think that it would be tremendously valuable to anybody who wishes to learn more. Join us in that journey and that community. So there is a link in the description, and remember, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, usually in the bottom right hand of your screen. So let's get back to this question about journalism and whether or not we had a failure of journalism in relation to the pandemic. Listen to what Mariana Cloak said from CBC. That's one of the national public broadcasting centers in Canada. And this is what she had to say. And I think that it is very, very valuable for us to hear her perspective.
Reputation of excellence for years, and now we were quickly shutting down one side of the debate. And how were we doing that? We branded the doctors and the experts the CBC chose that we used in our stories. We branded them as competent and trustworthy, and those who questioned and challenged the narrative were portrayed as dangerous and spreading disinformation. And that was regardless of what their specialty was, what their background was, and what their experience was. And I just also want to sort of give you a window into how this affected me personally. As a veteran journalist, I had solid contacts in the community. I had people calling me with stories. So I was seeing and I was hearing and I was absorbing all their stories of suffering and pain, and they were sharing them with me, and these stories weren't being told. Some of those were from the vaccine injured. Some were from people who had lost their job because of their vaccination status, those whose families had been blown apart and they'd been ostracized, university students who were depressed over repeated lockdowns and mandates, and parents who were calling me that were agonizing on whether they should vaccinate their child or not. So all these stories were sitting inside of me, they were left with me, and I felt the crushing burden and the weight of their truth not being given a voice. And it affected my well-being because these people trusted me, and I felt I had failed them and I had let them down. It was like I had failed these people as a journalist to give voice to their truth. So I had witnessed in a very short time the collapse of journalism, news gathering, investigative reporting, and the way I saw it is that we were in fact pushing propaganda. And to define propaganda, it's information, ideas, opinions, or images that give one part of an argument, which are broadcast, published, in order to influence a person's opinion. And mental health workers have their own definition of propaganda as manipulative persuasion in the service of an agenda.
Awful stuff that we heard there. And she's quite right, is that journalism did fail in the pandemic. They just didn't ask some of the obvious questions. I mean, it's quite remarkable that in reality, we had a situation where there were so many unanswered questions, and the journalists didn't step up to ask them. Now, the one of the biggest problems, and I have to go back right to the start of the questions, the biggest question that was, which is, what was the origin of the virus? Can you believe that at this point there is still no clear consensus as to where it came from, which animal it came from? Was it potentially also a lab leak? I mean, the fact that that is not answered after 4.5 years. Now, forget about the scientific community. That would have been an incredible scoop by a journalist. A journalist should have been digging to try and find out exactly what happened. How can you explain that journalism wasn't interested in that question? Even after all the testimonies of all the strange patterns where if it wasn't a lab leak, why did the US scientific community try and cover it up? Why didn't they ask the questions? What about the funding? How about the patent in the spike protein? There are just so many questions that really weren't answered. Failure of journalism is literally I mean, what can you say? That when I think about it and when I look at it objectively, we had a situation where questions were not answered. A lot of money was passed. Lots of political decisions were made that didn't quite make sense. You could see the targeting of different medication, the way how everything was put together to not have journalists anywhere in the world asking questions is unbelievable. So I don't think that journalists weren't asking questions. I just think that the journalists who were able to publish and have reach couldn't. So there's a difference because I really can't accept that journalists across the world were not curious and were not looking for that scoop that would investigate and break open these incredible stories and narratives. And she's right, a lot of it was propaganda. And how you can know is that when someone categorically tells you something that is impossible to be true, that's propaganda. So a simple thing at the moment they're talking about AstraZeneca and the fact that a child died. And when you actually think about it, if someone says safe and effective early in the pandemic, which is what they were saying, that was impossible to know because we didn't have the even the short term, medium term, long term studies. You can say based on the information that we've got, maybe we don't see as much, but you cannot categorically be sure. But the fact that there were so many people who were sure and were able to go and state that assuredness without any scientific backup, that definitely was propaganda. And certainly from my perspective, when I looked at it from a scientific perspective, my concern then, now, is still autoimmunity. If the virus through the spike protein triggers a cytokine storm, which is an overreaction of your immune system, what are the risks if you then expose everybody to the same spike protein that could trigger this autoimmune cytokine storm? It's a really basic question, it's not complex. And so that's really what we should have been concentrating on, understanding the science. Now, that aside, we still have a situation where we have a lot of people who were also contributing to what happened. And you have to remember, it's not just politicians. Politicians will do what they can get away with. And so if the population is not willing to ask questions, they'll do it again. So I'll give you an example, and I want you to think about this carefully. For a second, let's just assume that a lab leak was correct. Let's pretend that nobody knows. And it is possible that this had happened, where the virus had been engineered to cause as much damage as possible. Your first question is, who benefits? How do they benefit? Financially, otherwise, control. Who actually did it? Why did they do it? What were the mechanisms? What were the exchange of funds? Now, here's the important bit, because this is kind of like, if you assume the lab leak was correct, and I'm saying that just for the sake of the platform, let's assume that it could be correct. You therefore know that there are people, scientists, um, financial people, who are willing to let people die and be sick for the purpose of power and money. That's what a lab leak would indicate. And when I look at the characteristics of the spike protein and what it can do and how much damage it can cause, if this was made in a lab, this was designed to cause maximum damage. Now, if you have a situation where you don't ask questions, okay? So this is one thing to say, you know what, let's forget about it, but not to ask the question, not to raise it properly. If there are people out there who could do that, you're almost guaranteed they're going to do it again. It's like robbing a bank. If the person robbed the bank and you said, yeah, maybe they didn't mean it, it was just a mistake, they accidentally walked into the vault, yeah, they got away with a lot of money, but let's move on. Do you not think they're going to do it again? So here is a point to the journalists. And you have to start reflecting, and this is where journalism, I just did some basic research, and maybe I should be a journalist actually, because I know what the questions are to ask. We have a situation here now where monkeypox is being elevated. First it was bird flu, now it's monkeypox. My question was, I just went back and I was thinking to myself, when did this virus come about? Where did it come from? And goodness, just within a few minutes of me doing research and seeing the timeline and the reason that not theoretically, it's called monkeypox because invariably they found it in monkeys that were in a lab that they were testing for something else. Now, listen, the reality is that it's a version of smallpox. And if it could be engineered, which based on the timeline, because it wasn't around before the 1950s, the first case was 1970. So therefore, it just seemed to come out of nowhere. And we don't see lots of animals with it. It raises the real possibility of where did it come from? Can it be engineered further to be able to be spread by aerosol? Because that's the huge thing. At the moment, it is spread largely by contact. But if it was to be able to be spread easily by aerosol, that is extremely serious based on the different clades. Nobody asks these questions. It's unbelievable. I mean, it really is unbelievable. So it's one thing to have a failure of journalism then, but to still have a failure of journalism is to make the same mistake twice, to still not be asking the questions. That, I think, is unacceptable. I don't know what we do because I have never seen anything like this where journalists across the world have failed, have done a dereliction of their duty. Their job is not to bring us news, their job is to uncover the truth. If their job is just there to bring us what they're being told to bring, they are marketers, not journalists. Basically, a journalist is supposed to do the work that nobody wants them to publish. That's the kind of thing that Snowden did, where it causes so much havoc in the sense that people are so scared of the information that they won't do the wrong thing. We don't seem to have that kind of journalism anymore, which is a problem. It's a pity. But it raises serious issues for where we are today. If this continues and we have another opportunity for engineering of viruses, bacteria, whatever, the world is sitting ducks. And it will be our fault for not asking the hard questions. Let's hope that we can do better tomorrow and not make the mistakes that we made yesterday. Have a great evening.